Good evening, good morning. Welcome to the 2021 AIB annual meeting. This is the third day of our annual meeting, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion on biodiversity in green financing. This is a critical issue, and we've identified a distinguished panel of speakers to talk about this topic, which is front and center in the global stage, especially given the close links between climate change, biodiversity, One Health, and the challenges facing us in terms of the health of the planet also. For AIB, we ensure that the sustainability of our activities in many ways. On the first day of our annual meeting, President Jin announced our plans for climate change and 50% of our financing being climate finance by 2025, and all of our projects being fully aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement by mid-2023, and I'm here in the UK on my way to the COP26 meetings in Glasgow. At the same time, in China, the COP15 meetings on biodiversity are also taking place between now and next summer. And so biodiversity is of particular interest to AIB to stay abreast of emerging global biodiversity concerns, methods of assessment and management measures also. So our panel today will shed a lot more light on these issues, hopefully highlighting some of the interactions between biodiversity and the issues that will be discussed at COP26 and COP15, but also how infrastructure projects can incorporate biodiversity, not just as a safeguard where we prevent harm and we offset, but also thinking about nature-based solutions to infrastructure challenges so that we can contribute positively to biodiversity whilst also investing in the infrastructure that our members need. We'll take questions at the end. So all four speakers will give opening remarks or presentations. If you want to ask a question, please raise the question through the chat box and we will come to it at the end. So I'm going to introduce each of the speakers before they speak. So without further ado, let me first say that I'm delighted to introduce Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, a Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge, and author of the review commissioned by the UK Treasury, the independent review on the economics of biodiversity, which was published in February 2021, now known as the Dasgupta Review. So he'll be joining us through a video message. So if I may, I'd like to introduce Professor Partha Dasgupta.
Good day, everyone. It is an honor to have been invited to speak at this year's annual meeting. There is now no escaping the fact that we are collectively damaging nature at an alarming rate. This rapid degradation of our environment will have dire consequences for our economies and our well-being. However, the economic consequences of biodiversity loss are often overlooked. And that is why in spring 2019, I was asked by the UK Treasury to lead an independent global review on the economics of biodiversity. My review considers nature as an asset, just as produced capital and human capital are assets. Natural capital provides a multitude of goods and services on which our economies depend. For example, it provides us with water, fuel, and food. It regulates our climate, controls disease, and decomposes our waste. Biodiversity is an essential characteristic of nature. Just as diversity within a portfolio of financial assets reduces risk and uncertainty, diversity within a portfolio of natural assets increases nature's resilience to shocks. The depletion of our natural assets undermines nature's productivity and adaptability. At the global level, COVID-19 and climate change are both striking expressions of nature's loss of resilience. If we continue to jeopardize nature's processes, it is not only our economies that are in trouble, but our lives too. At the heart of the problem lies the fact that nature's worth to society is not reflected in the prices we face, maybe whether they are market prices or administered prices. Nature is mobile, silent, and invisible. The wind blows, fish swim, and we cannot see or hear the vital processes taking place in the soil beneath our feet. This means that the effects of our actions on the natural world are hard to trace and go unaccounted for, making it very hard for markets and institutions more broadly to function well. This has led us to invest comparatively little in ecosystems and their biodiversity, while at the same time continuing to fund activities harmful to nature. Worse still, governments almost everywhere exacerbate the pricing problem by subsidizing the use of nature. In effect, we pay ourselves to exploit rather than protect our home. In my review, I argue that the solution starts with understanding a simple truth. Our economies are embedded in nature, not external to it. To walk a more sustainable path, we need to change how we think, act, and measure success. Our collective failure to achieve sustainability has its roots in our institutions. Effective institutions are the foundations on which to rebuild our engagement with nature and manage our assets well. In particular, our global financial system will be critical to supporting more sustainable engagement with nature. The problem is to encourage the financial system to take note of accounting prices, not the prices we face, if only implicitly. The qualification is required because at the moment, the market prices of natural capital are far from their accounting prices, that is, their social worth. So there needs to be an effective regulatory environment, necessary incentives and market structures to induce greater private investment in nature. One such means is for governments and international financial institutions, like the multilateral development banks, to invest in nature. This involves channeling investments, both public and private, towards economic activities that enhance our stock of natural assets and away from activities that encourage unsustainable consumption and production. Mechanisms are being developed to help overcome the barriers to mobilizing finance for nature, including blended finance, pooled funds, and methods to improve the understanding of nature-related risk and create transparency. A set of global standards is ultimately required, underpinned by data that are both credible and useful for decision-making. At a larger level, there is a need for institutions to manage the gigantic global public goods that are represented in nature. I have in mind, for example, the open seas, beyond the 200-mile EEZ, that is, which cover probably about 65% of the Earth's surface. And I have also in mind the tropical rainforests, which cover so much of South Asia, Africa, and the Amazon region. Now, these two pairs of global public goods, for example, as an example, have different characteristics. The first, the open oceans, are open access. Nobody owns them. And so we use them freely for transportation of container ships, for example, and cruises, as well as for fishing, deep sea fishing. And that way we spoil the seas, oceans. And we, of course, use it as a dumping ground for our pollutants. On the other hand, the latter, the tropical rainforests, are within national jurisdiction. So it seems that the institutions we need now are international ones, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, an institution which could be created to manage the oceans, the great biome, which is a global public good, charging for their use. That could raise billions of dollars annually, which in part could be used to compensate countries that house global commons, such as the tropical rainforests, to protect them, not to degrade them further. We outsiders moan and groan over the fact that the tropical rainforests are being devastated, but the nations that house them can equally complain that it is not their task to supply the world with the services that the tropical rainforests are offering us. So there are ways that can be looked for through creation of an institution that manage it, but at the moment we don't have them. The review makes clear that time is not on our side. Urgent action is now required. Humanity faces a fundamental choice: We can continue down our current path, or we can take a different route where we engage sustainably with nature, enhancing our collective wealth and well-being. As the world's fastest growing economic region and home to many of the world's mega biodiverse countries, Asia has a hugely important role to play if collectively we are to walk the better path. Our descendants deserve nothing less.
Professor Dasgupta, thank you very much indeed. And the Dasgupta review has been highly influential in this space. And I think from that presentation, we heard the importance of connecting, thinking about biodiversity with the economy to understand better how we can incentivize the right solutions to these problems. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Ms. Deborah Lair. Deborah is Vice Chairman and Executive Director of the Paulson Institute. So we have a connection problem from Ms. Lair, so we'll come to her later in the order of speakers. And I'd like to now introduce Madame Aban Marka Kabraji. Ms. Kabraji is the Senior Advisor on Climate Change and Biodiversity in the UN Office for Asia Pacific. Before that, she served as the Regional Director for IUCN Asia and Director of the IUCN Regional Hub for Asia Oceania, which is the largest region of the IUCN. And she was involved in overseeing and maintaining a diverse portfolio in 15 countries in the Asia and Oceania regions, as well as being responsible for driving strategic direction of close to 300 organizations composed of governments, international and national NGOs, states and indigenous groups. With her more than 40 years of global and cross-border experience, her leadership has been really essential in drawing attention to some of the issues that we're talking today. So we're delighted to have you with us, Madam Kabraji, and we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say. Over to you.
Annie, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good evening. I'm just doing a sound check. Can you hear me?
Very clearly.
You're right. Thank you very much. Sorry, I had a bit of confusion in terms of the chat room. Ladies and gentlemen, the global response to the twin crises of climate change impact and biodiversity loss is guided by two conventions: the Climate Change Convention, the UNFCCC, and the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. These direct policy and legislation at both national and international level. A growing concern, however, is that the two are often treated separately rather than through a recognition of their inextricable linkages. As a result, investment decisions and safeguards are often determined in the absence of an appreciation of the codependent nature of life systems. In order to avoid conflict in implementation between the two conventions, one needs to recognize the synergies when they exist or not, and the trade-offs and their costs when you find you do not have the synergies. First slide, please. If you look at a very simplistic comparison between the two conventions, and you look at the green circle, you see that in the areas of climate change adaptation, you find many synergies with the CBD. And these are understandable because you're looking really at nature-based solutions when you look at climate change adaptation aspects. So CBD and the biodiversity aspects of living systems become an integral and a symbiotic relationship between the two. When it comes to climate change mitigation, however, one is looking much more at solutions which have land-based responses like carbon capture, carbon reduction, renewable energy. And there very often one is looking at trade-offs rather than synergies. Next. Examples, as you can see, and these are mostly the mitigation responses that you look at on the left. You can look, for example, when you look at solar, when you look at wind energy, when you look at hydro, or monoculture plantations, bioenergy, carbon capture, you are usually looking at a trade-off in terms of biodiversity, degradation or loss, or certainly stress. And where you're looking at loss of habitat, you're looking at ecosystem degradation, noise pollution, wildlife conflict, exotic species being introduced, and very often a threat to food security and water security. And I'll illustrate these now by examples, real life examples that we see all over the place, particularly in Asia. Next. One of the areas where we're constantly seeing problems is in the case of monoculture plantation versus natural restoration. Now, nature-based solutions certainly include tree plantation. But when it comes to tree plantation, the issue is whether one chooses the monoculture system, which does allow for carbon capture, but certainly not in terms of also maintaining good biodiversity strength, as you would in natural restoration. Next. We can move on now to another real-life example in Indonesia. In the island of Sumatra, you have a hydropower project which is fulfilling 3% of Indonesia's NDC. This particular hydropower project is placed in a forest, a virgin forest in Sumatra, which happens to contain the last population, the only population of a particular orangutan called the Tapanuli orangutan, of which there are only 800 species. The nature of the project is that it divides the forest up into 3 blocks, which means that the population is left in 3 residual parts of the forest with a real danger that they may not connect and therefore move the entire population to extinction. This is an example of a climate change mitigation project, which is certainly very well worth doing. But on the other hand, look at the cost in terms of biodiversity loss. You are looking at the possible extinction of a species. And here is an example again, where had there been upstream planning and upstream management in terms of the kind of possible conflicts between the two, there could have been far better planning in terms of the siting of the site. Now, of course, they are trying to respond by mitigation measures, but there are questions in terms of whether those mitigation measures will be adequate and actually cause the species to survive. Next. It's become a fairly major international issue, and you get the kind of press then that you see in this slide. The map shows you the forest areas and the 3 different forest blocks that would be affected as the project proceeds. Next. And we have another example from India, where you have another very endangered species of bird, the great Indian bustard. And here you get, again, climate change mitigation. 2 examples in terms of in terms of wind power and in terms of the solar possibilities. In this case, what is happening in terms of solar, you're affecting the habitat of the bird because you cover it up with the land with various solar panels, and that affects biodiversity and habitat. And in terms of wind power, you're going to be affecting the survival of the bird because the bird slams straight into the transmission lines and die. So the Supreme Court stepped in this case and stopped the projects. And at the moment they're on hold, they're under review. And the Supreme Court had said all power lines need to be put under the soil so that you don't get the kind of conflict with the birds. Now, here again is another example of the 2 conventions, because the wind and solar contribute to India's NDC targets. And the loss of biodiversity clearly conflicts with the 2030 biodiversity target. So again, some understanding of the kind of synergies and trade-offs between the 2 conventions before one starts planning would be extremely helpful to any kind of investment decisions. Next. And of course, again, you see the kind of press that results in terms of a lack of foresight in terms of looking at the synergies or the lack of between biodiversity and climate change. Do you move on? Now, there is study, and there is a group called the Finance for Biodiversity Initiative, which is looking specifically at the kind of risks for the big development banks, the public development banks such as Aiib in Asia. And if you look at those charts, I mean, there is, of course, much more information which one can obtain from the group. You will look at both the sectoral and regional risk analysis. And the risks are in three categories: a dependence on nature at risk, and the assets that the banks hold exposed to those risks. The top slide shows the regional analysis, the bottom one a sectoral analysis, and I'd like to draw you to the attention of how major a role Asia plays in that particular analysis. Next. So what should financial institutions like AIIB do? These are the sorts of recommendations that one could put forward and which the Finance for Biodiversity Initiative does. They're suggesting that the global study of public development banks, such as the World Bank, the ADB, the China Development Bank, are actually showing that the potential damage to nature from development banked activities could be in the range of about 800 billion annually, US dollars. The nature at risk equates to 7 cents for every dollar invested. The research finds that the PDBs, of which there are more than 450 globally, are exposing themselves to huge nature-related dependency risks. We know that the PDB investments are highly dependent on water, soil, pollination, and other ecosystem services, and 40% of PDB assets, close to 4.6 trillion, exposed to nature-related risks through their high dependence on vulnerable nature. The momentum is growing around PDB disclosure and transparency, and the suggestion which I'll leave you with in my presentation, and there was some reference to this in Sir Danny's open statement as well, that AIIB may also wish to develop standard operating procedures for implementing safeguards, for example, the IFC-PSB, and it may wish to consider a review of its entire investment portfolio, nature-related financial risks and impacts, to ensure that the kind of examples that I gave, of which there are many, many all over Asia, of conflict and trade-offs between biodiversity and climate change, don't continue to recur, because ultimately this is damaging not just to biodiversity and climate change impact, but also to the investors and where they're putting their finances and to development more generally. Thank you very much.
Ms. Abraham-Kabaji, thank you very much indeed for those very thoughtful and interesting remarks, and a lot of issues raised there that I'm sure we'll return to in the presentation. Just to reassure you, from AIB's point of view, we carry out comprehensive environmental and social due diligence for all of the infrastructure projects, and prepare mitigation and management actions to address potential risks and impacts. And biodiversity is one of the critical parameters of this work. Sure, there are ways that we can improve, but we do screen every project that we consider for potential impacts on biodiversity, as well as many other issues. So your suggestions are very well received. Thank you for them. So now it's my great privilege to turn the floor to Professor Kongjian Yu. Professor Yu is Professor and Dean of Peking University Graduate School of Landscape, and founder and design principal of Tourandscape, which practices globally. He's a strong advocate of ecological security patterns and sponge cities, and the idea has been adopted by the Chinese government as part of its nationwide ecological campaign. And his innovative approach to urban planning has been implemented in over 200 cities in China and also outside China, and has significantly impacted on national policies for improving the environment in China. Professor Yu, we met when you came to the bank and presented some of your work to encourage our institution to think more about how we can build in nature positive solutions to infrastructure. So very pleased that you're with us today and look forward very much to your presentation. So Professor Yu, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful introduction. So we are all talk about where the money should be invested to deal with so many problems. We have so much problems to deal with: flood, drought, pollution, habitat loss. Now we are talking about biodiversity. I'm talking about how we can have a holistic solutions, not just for individual species, but a whole transformation of infrastructure that's related to climate change. Now, the conventional solution for such to deal with these all kind of problems, pollution, habitat loss, and flood and drought, is great infrastructure, which AIIB and the World Bank always are interested in. Build stronger and increasingly more sophisticated damming, channelizing the rivers, flood walls fighting against water, and very sophisticated sewage plant to clean the water. Now, great infrastructure made of concrete and steels can be necessary to solve urgent individual problems such as flood, but it consumes huge amount of concrete and energy, destroys nature and its resiliency, lacks resilience, and often accumulates higher risk of disaster, such as flood, and breaks the connection between man and nature. So the alternative is nature-based solution, the ecological infrastructure, which is critical for securing ecosystem services we are talking about. And this ecological infrastructure must be woven together with the grey infrastructure in a holistic way. Now, the ecological infrastructure must be planned and be built across a scale, from national, regional, and local, and to solve the problem in a systematic way and holistic way. Water is a key to such ecological infrastructure. A city built upon water-centered ecological infrastructure is called sponge city. Its philosophy is to retain water, slow down water, and clean water by nature, and to be adaptive to water. Totally opposite to the conventional solution of grey infrastructure, which you have invested so much money to build. For over 20 years, we have tested and built over 500 projects in more than 200 cities and developed several replicable models for healing the land at various scales. Flood, for example, flood situation in China, all urban rivers have been dammed and channelized with concrete flood wall, which been financed by banks. But more than 20 billion US dollars is invested to control such kind of flooding every year. But at the same time, 100 billion get lost every year due to flood. We have to end this never-ending war. But does that mean we have to invest more on concrete to stop flooding or to keep the city from being flooded? Not necessary. We have a better way. Now, this is the ecological solution. This is the case in Zhejiang's Jinhua city. Instead of building higher and stronger flood wall, we actually remove the flood wall and create a terraced ecological riverbank. Now, this is a resilient riverbank based on nature, terracing the ground and create such a resilient landscape. Let water come into the city. Such ecological embankment can reduce the peak flow by more than half. This is a 20-year flood. The previous slide shows a 100-year flood. A similar case we have done 20 years ago is in Zhejiang's Taizhou city. As you can see, it's very strong, powerful flood wall made of concrete and steel, but lifeless, no biodiversity at all, and it's really totally ugly. Our solution again is to remove this concrete wall and introduce back nature. And this is for 20 years, it's been tested, and the city shows that it's more resilient, more beautiful, and more life, more biodiversity, of course. In China, over 65% of cities are suffering urban inundation, and global-wise, You will see East Asia, Asia, Southeast Asia, India, Bangladesh, all suffering urban inundation. Now, does that mean we have to build thicker pipelines, thicker concrete drainage, or powerful pumps? May not. We may not. We can have maybe have better and easier, less expensive solutions, inspired by ancient wisdom of terracing the slope, pounding the ground, islanding the swamp. We can create resilient green sponge within the city. Now, this is the case in Sanya Hainan Island in South China, suffering monsoon climate every year, suffering urban inundation. So we created such a kind of green sponge right in the middle of the city, and just take 1 year to create such simple engineering project based on the nature. This is today you will see a huge green sponge right in the middle of the city that is resilient, deal with monsoon season. Now this city not only solves the problem of urban inundation, but all kind of ecosystem services, including economic increase. You can see just in 4 years, urban development being catalyzed by this ecological restoration, or we'll say it's green sponge in the middle of the city. Now, 75% of Chinese surface water is contaminated. 85% of sewage globally goes to rivers and seas untreated. But does that mean we have to build more and more sewage treatment plant? But maybe not. Maybe not. We can have a better solution. We're more efficient to this solution to solve this global-wise problem. Constrained wetland can remove nutrients from the through the biological process to clean the water. Here's an example. In Shanghai's Huangpu River, 10 years ago, we actually built a living system, a living landscape to clean the water by terracing the ground and planted with all kind of vegetation. By the way, this is the diversity, by diverse habitat get recovered and water get cleansed. The park's 3 hectares of constricted wetland filters phosphorus and other nutrients from 2,400 cubic meter of clean water, of water from dirty to clean every day. And we have the 10-year data to show that, which is really a successful, inexpensive solution. Now, this can be a very effective solution for larger scale water issues. The Bohai Sea, for example, over 700,000 square kilometer in size, is seriously contaminated and become a dead sea. No life at all, you can see. And our solution, as I said, is a sponge land or sponge planet, is to create a green porous landscape to water runoff, to catch the chemicals from the land and to clean it before they run into the ocean. And this pilot project has been proved to be very successful. Climate change, of course, more and more storm and stronger surge and higher risk. But does that mean we have to build a higher concrete, stronger flood wall? May not. We have better way. In this case, we want to restore the mangrove along the coastal line. But as a key challenge is to find an efficient and inexpensive method to establish this mangrove that had been destroyed like that. So we use urban debris and concrete from the demolition of the flood wall was recycled on site, and an interlocking finger design was used to let ocean tide into the waterway to create a tide habitat, to create ideal habitat for mangroves and all kind of coastal habitat to different species. Here you can see in just 3 years, we totally recovered the lifeless land and create a really lush urban oasis. Now, I'm not just talking about a piece of land, a piece of park. I'm talking about whole infrastructure, a transformation of gray infrastructure into green infrastructure. This is a 21-kilometer long Meise River in Haikou, Hainan Island. Again, the city is suffering flood, pollution, and the city government tried to solve the problem by building higher and higher flood wall, and dredging the riverbed, tried to make it clean, and never get a success. For 20 years, it's become a noise for the city. So we take the green way, remove the concrete, terracing the riverbank, covers the nature, and filtrates the urban runoff, and in some cases, it's the sewage from the village, from the urban village. Now the whole infrastructure get transformed from gray into green, and again we show that the removal effect and cumulative removal effect is about 80% or more. Now habitat get recovered, birds come back, fish come back to the river, and at the same time we create a beautiful park that serves the people in the city. So more than ever, we have
So I think we have just temporarily lost connection with Professor Yu. I think we'll. I know our team is trying to reconnect him, and I think also, unfortunately, so far Deborah Lair has had some connection problems also. Which so I wanted to say, Deborah is vice chair of the Paulson Institute, and an executive director of the Paulson Institute, and I very much wanted to have a chance to hear her. So I know that we will try and connect her, because Paulson Institute is also we've been developing a very strong partnership with the AIIB exactly on some of the issues that we're discussing in this session, to do with the kind of macro issues that Professor Dasgupta described, where the Paulson Institute has produced some very good work on the financial needs for green infrastructure and how those financing needs can be met, and has also helped AIB to access some new tools to help to screen some of the biodiversity issues for projects that we're financing. So if she can join us, then we will come back to her. But otherwise, let's go on with the panel discussion. Firstly, I just wanted to summarize some of the things that we've heard about, because we've heard the issues in this panel discussed from quite a wide range of different perspectives. Professor Dasgupta talked about the landmark review that he has produced. He talked about the obligations on national governments in conservation and preservation of biodiversity, and also the downsides that we suffer because of the absence of systems in place to create the incentives for this to happen, both in the economy and also for governments also. And the lack of capacity so far to monetize natural capital and therefore help the proactive management of it. And also advise us to be careful about sometimes the conflicts that can occur between climate finance and adverse impacts on biodiversity. And this latter point was a key theme of Ms. Aban Kabraji's presentation. And she cited some examples where the trade-off between meeting climate change targets on the one hand and biodiversity conservation on the other were not managed in a proper way, and so good projects that deliver on climate change had consequences in terms of biodiversity loss, which could have been prevented if those issues were identified right at the start, if the projects had been redesigned slightly or recited. And she also touched upon the fact that indigenous peoples are the best stewards for biodiversity conservation in many areas. And then Professor Yu talked from his own experience about the nature-based solutions that he personally and working with organizations or governments in China and elsewhere have been able to actually implement. And that was, in a way, connecting the other two presentations to the kind of real infrastructure that we can develop on the ground. I've seen for myself the project in Sanya that he referred to, and it's a remarkable example of how you can use natural solutions much more effectively to meet some of these challenges than through the concrete and channelization that he referred to as being the natural or the seemingly natural reflex of designers when they're trying to tackle these questions. So if I may, I would like to then open up the Q&A. So Ms. Kabaji, could I come to you first? Maybe I'd ask you to just reflect on some of the issues that Professor Yu raised in his presentation, because I think in a way the approach that he is showing shows how you can have effective infrastructure projects that meet other targets, be they water, waste management, climate, and so forth, but by fully integrating biodiversity at the design stage, enable you to have even a positive impact on biodiversity, and at the very least ensure that you're not having the kind of severe adverse impacts that you were referring to. Do you think that's a model that could be used more widely?
Absolutely. I think what Professor Yu has demonstrated in his examples are the best sort of illustration of what nature-based solutions are all about, which is natural infrastructure. And if you go back to using natural infrastructure and nature as a response to some of the climate change and even otherwise natural disasters that we see all the time, I think we'd be on a much more sustainable path. China has some extremely good examples globally to teach the world in terms of major and just in terms of scale, the kind of investment they've put into their cities and into the whole issue of sponge cities, but also more than that, even floodplain restoration in terms of absorption and restoration of water tables has been something that I think a lot of countries could learn from, and certainly ought to be, I think, part of an investment agenda of the banks for both biodiversity restoration and climate change adaptation and mitigation.
Thank you very much. It's Professor Yu. Is Professor Yu there? So there was one question that came in that I can see. Professor Yu, you're there. Okay, great. I'm sorry, I just can see you. So thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry that you were cut off part way through. So if you would like to come back on any of the points that you were going to make that we didn't have the chance to hear from, we'd be glad to do it. But I think also one question that I have for you is that you've been a promoter of very innovative nature-based solutions to the infrastructure challenges that people are facing, both in China and also more broadly. When one sees the images you present on your presentation, it seems somehow obvious that these are the kind of solutions we should pursue. And yet, as you said in your remarks, that it's sometimes quite hard to persuade policymakers, financiers like ourselves and others to say, let's try and embrace this kind of solution instead. What are the barriers to getting people to think in this way? And how can we address those?
Okay, yeah. Well, the barrier is certainly number one barrier is policy. Policy, I think that's why we have to convince the decision makers, global decision makers, and municipal decision makers. That's number one. The second, I think it is intellectual monumentality. It's a mentality. I mean, mentality is intellectual thinking. So we have a powerful engineering group here, powerful, very old knowledge based on so-called scientific understanding, but it's a totally pseudo fake scientific understanding or hydrological process of. So we need really both. Number one, we have to change the intellectual infrastructure. Second, we have to have policy change, and certainly, of course, the financing, like your institute. I think if you can lead some investment, we will have a better able to change the policy and the engineering way of doing things. Right now, we are actually talking about Bangladesh and India. They follow the model of developed countries. You know, they use totally wrong infrastructure to solve the problem of monsoon climate. So I think that's important. If our AIIB can lead and see the money to lead this direction, we can largely solve the problem easily. Yes.
Well, that sounds quite simple, but and certainly for AIB, we see a lot of benefits in many dimensions from the point of view of our objectives. We at AIB, our focus is on what we call infrastructure for tomorrow. We want to think about what kind of infrastructure our members are going to need for the next few decades of those development, and that means climate resilience, it means technology enabled, it means connectivity, it means mobilizing the private sector, but it also means green infrastructure that helps to ensure that we're also dealing with the challenge of biodiversity loss and habitat loss, and we're trying to make sure that our projects are not doing any harm, and where we can, making a positive contribution in that dimension. I think it's critical, and it feels like the biodiversity debate that we're having now is getting increasing profile on the international stage. About time too, many would say, and that the interactions between some of the major issues that we're seeing in our world are being more and more recognized. The connection between climate change and biodiversity loss, and we have this concept of one health, about human health and planetary health together, and where biodiversity causes habitat loss, which causes more conflict between man and nature, which among other things causes diseases to enter the human population, which might not otherwise be there. And so recognizing those connections, I think just therefore highlights the need for institutions like ours to focus on these issues. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to ask the questions rather than answer them, but you make a really important point. But so, Professor, you want to come back, and then I have a question for Ms. Kabraji. Professor,
okay.
Over to you. No, Professor, you please. I'll come back to you now if you want to say something, and then we'll go to Ms. Kabraji.
Well, I think it's particularly important for AIIB because you are for Asia. For Asia, because most part of Asia is underdeveloped. And the most part, I mean, particularly East Asia, Southeast Asia, are suffering monsoon climate. So it's important right now to determine what kind of infrastructure we have to use to deal with these problems. And infrastructure is a major destroyer of nature and it destroyer of nature system. So that's one point I want to make. So you are so important. The AIIB is so important right now, critical. The second point I want to make is that we have to think systematically, not just one single goal about diversity. We have carbon neutral, that's another goal. We have pollution, that's another goal. So infrastructure must be holistic, comprehensive, solve the problem. That's my 2 points I have to make. Yes.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to the complexity and the international and the interrelationships between these different challenges in a moment. Ms. Kabraji, Professor, you referred to the importance of Asia there. You've spent your career focused on Asia and Oceania, particularly in these contexts. Do you see specific challenges in Asia or specific solutions that can be embraced in this region that maybe would help?
Goodness, where does one begin? Both in terms of the challenges and the opportunities. I think Asia presents, frankly, the future of the world for all the various reasons, not just biodiversity, population, strategic interests, etc. I mean, if we can find the solutions to climate change and biodiversity loss anywhere and actually fix them, it'll be in this continent. So I think in that sense, AIB plays a very important role. And to answer your question, Sadani, I'd like to get to the one point that Professor Dasgupta made, which I think is extremely important. And that is, can the institutions that we currently have actually, are they geared? Are they capable? Do they actually have a fit for purpose in terms of the problems we're facing in climate change and biodiversity loss? Or do we need to create another set of institutions? He talked about an institution for the oceans and an institution for the land, basically. I don't know whether one would actually get that easily, but certainly newer institutions like AIIB are institutions that are relatively recently designed and formulated, I think have a much greater opportunity to adapt and design the future in a way that is more responsive to the world of today. Because you're not as, in a sense, committed to patterns of working that were developed with the Bretton Woods institutions, which really is all we have today in terms of addressing the problems, where we've inherited a combination of the Bretton Woods institutions and what came out of Rio, which is when the two conventions of climate change and biodiversity were formulated. So maybe we do need a different kind of institution, a different kind of mindset. And maybe that's where AIB should start looking. And if, you know, in terms of what Professor Yu just talked about, if AIB could start redefining all its infrastructure in terms of green infrastructure, in terms of nature-based solutions, I think that would be a dramatic shift, both in terms of conceptual thinking and planning. I know you say you have all your projects reviewed, and I'm aware of that because I've been in touch with the AIB, and I'm currently doing some work with you as well. And so I am aware that there is great good intent and goodwill in terms of the way you're doing your things. But I'm talking about perhaps having a higher level of ambition in terms of how the bank presents itself in terms of a leader on investment in green infrastructure. And Asia is, to my mind, the place to start. Not just in terms of one country, one project, but conceptually and even otherwise as an overall framework for the development of the investments in the bank. And then you bring the countries along, you bring the investors along, and you start setting up a model for the future.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I'd say that as new institutions, you do have an opportunity to learn lessons and from the past and see how things can be done a little bit differently, as well as learning from the successes. At the same time, I think for AIB, you both put very high, very high expectations, which we're grateful for. But at the same time, I think we have to be humble. We're developing our institution, building up. This is a key area in which we need to focus and learn. But I think we can also learn a lot from other institutions. But if I may, your last point, Ms. Kabaji, links to a question that we've received from the audience directed to you. So the questioner says,
they're talking about, if I can see it on the chat, they're talking about taking a landscape approach, right?
That's right, exactly.
And I think, yeah, this is exactly, in a sense, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that rather than addressing it in terms of one project, one problem, one bridge, one hydro, if every project could be viewed in terms of its overall impact in a wider landscape that it affects and impacts on. In other words, raise the level of scale in terms of the assessments, so that you're looking at any kind of project within the landscape in which it is situated, not just maybe a valley or a mountain, but what is the, what is the impact in terms upstream of rivers, downstream of rivers, on forests that may reside in the wider watershed, and so on and so forth. And yes, of course, any kind of shifting to a wider understanding of the ecosystem and the multiplier effect on other ecosystems clearly makes for a much more sustainable project. So I would completely agree.
Thank you very much. I'd like to come back to Professor Yu, because I think part of the role of multilateral development banks is through the projects we invest in to invest in impactful projects where lessons can be learned, and then those lessons can be shared more widely. And I think part of the value of a session like this is to share some of the lessons that you as experts in the field have learned over the years. And so I want to ask Professor Yu, and this is a question that has come from the audience. What are the key lessons learned from the Sponge Cities projects in China? What challenges are there to scale up these kind of nature-based solutions in different countries? What lessons can we draw, and how can we share them so that those good learnings can be applied around the world?
Okay, certainly Sponge City have many misunderstanding here in the China and also the world, because people think that Sponge City will spend a lot of money, need a huge investment. That's totally wrong. That's totally wrong. Because they always it's been hijacked by a big company, big contractor. They try to make a budget higher and higher, and they try to make GDP higher for the individual cities. So that's a misunderstanding. Okay, it's put a label of Sponge City to solve the problem. Now, my suggestion is that the question about how to make it interesting for investor. First of all, it costs less. Okay, if you are a developer, if you're a big developer for developing a 10 square kilometer city, for example, I have to tell you, if you use Sponge City idea instead of building the pipe system to drain away the stormwater, you will save at least 15% of investment. Now, that's one interest you will have. So save money at the beginning without input so much great infrastructure, but let nature do the work, let nature provide the services. A second point I want to say is that when you the cities built, like Sanya, like Bangladesh, when you solve the problem of flood or urban inundation, and at the same time build a green park, a beautiful park, the property value will double. I'm sure the property value will double. So that's another interest for investor from the private section. The third interest is that when you want to transform a valley or region, and you better buy the region first, and you transform it easily and create another ecosystem which provide a much healthier services. So increasing the natural asset, then you turn this, make this place a beautiful, attractive place for development or for tourism. So that's my suggestion. My fourth suggestion I have actually tried myself is how to harvest the green infrastructure, how to harvest the services from the better ecosystem. Now that's about create a new life and pricing the product much higher. The green tea, which has less contamination, less polluted, less chemicals, will price double. Then you get investor return back. Yes.
This is fascinating because it links very much back to what Professor Dasgupta was saying at the beginning. That if you can create systems and economic systems that are well understood, that help to show what are the economic benefits, the economic value of nature-based solutions, of protecting and valuing biodiversity, then the way our economy thinks would be changed. And so you mentioned things that sound very attractive to property developers. Their costs go down, property values go up. You create great places for people to live or to visit as tourists. So that's that. I mean, I think that's an important point from your own professional experience. Now, I want to go back to another question that's come from the audience about development banks, public development banks. So we had a question directed to you, Ms. Kavraji, which where the question said, sometimes development banks invest in only one or a few individual projects in a region. How can development banks influence private sector or commercial banks to adopt safeguards for biodiversity if the government regulation is not in place? For example, environmental assessment is not required for wind power projects in India, is what the questioner says. I don't know if that last claim is correct, but the broader point is interesting, which is we talk often about the important role that government has, but actually private investors are critically important in this space. So how can private investors also be motivated and influenced to do the right thing in respect of the challenges we're discussing in this session?
Certainly, it's correct, actually. There is no EIA for wind power in India. And I think that's one of the problems, that in the absence of those kinds of regulations by government, then clearly investors don't have a framework to guide them in terms of what they can do or can't do. But then, it's a double-sided issue. Frequently, if investors themselves say that, look, where are the regulations? Because we can't invest until we have them. Frequently, governments produce them very quickly. So there is enormous leverage when you're bringing in money for investment in any country. And I think that leverage certainly can be used. And that's one of the areas where, in fact, the public development banks can influence private investment. Frequently, the standards that are set by the public development banks, I have noticed, particularly, by example, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, influences greatly government regulation development. So the leverage that the banks have in terms of influencing countries to get their own regulations and their own standards into place by demonstrating that you cannot invest unless you have some regulations to follow, incentivizes countries to put them into place. So there is, therefore, that's a knock-on influence in terms of then the private sector investment, because the kind of regulations that you influence and develop in countries inevitably then also affect the private sector. So there is that aspect, but that in a sense is rather ad hoc. I think if one had a greater policy alliance in terms of green infrastructure development between the public development banks and the private sector, and there were opportunities to develop those policies in a more consistent fashion. This again is looking to new coalitions and new ways of collaboration in the future in terms of addressing the sort of planetary crisis we have. And I take on board also very much your point, Zadani, about One Health, because ultimately the impact of COVID is directly related to biodiversity loss in some form or the other. There's no question about it. Whether the virus came via agricultural farming practices, whether it came, through a wildlife trade, whatever it is, it emerged from natural systems and leapt to humans in some form. And that means that there is a clear link between biodiversity disturbance and human health. And all this, again, is influenced by the way we are developing our infrastructure and our development. And so these are inextricable linkages. And unless one actually looks at them in a holistic context, both public and private sector, and uses this kind of understanding and comprehension of development practice in terms of making investment decisions, one will continue to see the kind of crises that we are seeing in terms of human health and human well-being.
That's a very important point. I think it's a central one in terms of the way that Aiib wants to think about these questions and link them together, and in a way is a great point on which to start to bring our discussion to a conclusion. But before I do, maybe I just also ask Professor Yu if you have any closing thoughts that you would like to share, and then I will wrap it up. But Professor Yu, maybe back to you for some final remarks.
Well, I just want to share with you that it's a critical time. We already know so much about climate change. We know we have so many challenges we are facing today. So the infrastructure is a key, is a critical crossroad right now. So I think I really hope that the AIIB can lead us away to the more green way. And we know how to do it. I think you really invest on this way. That's my point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I think with advice and support from you and Ms. Kabraji and Professor Dasgupta, we have a wealth of knowledge on which to draw as we embark on this journey and seek to invest in the infrastructure that our members need to support their sustainable economic development, but to do so in a way that not only helps to tackle the climate crisis, but also contributes positively to biodiversity issues. And your thinking on nature-based solutions, what Ms. Kabraji said about how these issues link together, I think is very important. I think I personally have enjoyed this discussion enormously, both the presentations and the Q&A. It gives us a great deal to think about. I really want to thank our speakers for their time and effort and participation in this meeting. It's been really passionate, enlightening, and I think for AIIB as a multilateral development bank gives us a lot to think about in terms of how we should be approaching some of these issues. We've had a large number of participants connecting through our webinar platform. I also would like to thank the team from our operational services department who has led the preparatory work for this panel. I'd like to thank both them and also the team in the AIIB Corporate Secretariat who have put the whole annual meeting program together. It's been a huge credit to the bank that we've had so many panels on such a wide range of issues, but helping us to develop our thinking for the future. So with that, I'd like to close this discussion. Thank you all for your participation and look forward to engaging in future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.